Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this fast forward planet, which is still wrapped in a pandemic. It doesn't feel that way sometimes, but it's the case. And vaccine inequity is kind of like climate inequity. There are these huge gaps in who's been vaccinated around the world, and that will kick back. It's a human heated planet and a turbulent one. We're passing a threshold, or technically we may have already passed it, but we're at 8 billion people. There were 1 billion people on planet Earth in 1800. There were 2.74 billion people on planet Earth when I was born in 1956, and now there are 8 billion. Every one of those people, except maybe the newborns, has aspirations to live a good life. Energy is part of that pathway to a good life, wherever you are on the planet, to cook on, to be mobile with, to be connected like we are with. Without energy, abundant energy, people will have tough lives, but without resilience to climate extremes, the same challenge exists. And as long as certain gases keep accumulating in the atmosphere, we are going to be in trouble with the idea of no new normal really is that the new normal is constant change and stresses, as again, those 8 getting to 9 billion people soon try to build lives and not be vulnerable to flooding, to heat, to pathogens and the like. I've got great guests coming on today to discuss a couple of aspects of what's going on in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Durwood Zilke is in the green room. I see Antoine Half there too, who's at Columbia, who has several affiliations. A couple of journalists are going to join us who are there through the Climate Tracker program in a few minutes. And President Biden is in the area and will be speaking probably around the end of this broadcast. So when Biden's speech starts, if I have time, I'll try to do a little live annotation of that as well, as you can see here. One of the key themes in his speech will be related to methane. The U.S. Embassy has already released talking points. The Wall Street Journal also has a story, as do other media, bolstering global climate resilience. The United States plans to double the U.S. pledge to the Adaptation Fund to $100 million. Remember, this is a world with tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, if not actually in the trillions of needs for development assistance, so countries can build their climate resilience and build their economies. There's a section in here on methane. Here's the Wall Street Journal article. Biden to announce restrictions on methane domestic, which will demonstrate the seriousness of the United States' commitment to making the most of this gas while limiting the downside. And that'll be at COP27, at this COP as well. I'm going to bring Durwood in right now. I see he's there. And Antoine, hold on a second. Let me try Durwood again. Oh, there we go. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Antoine, I'm going to mute you until you speak because there's a lot of background noise. So stay there.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Hold on a second. So Durwood Zelke has been a part of the sort of climate and ozone control push for a very, very, very long time. I've been on this beat since the 80s, and your career track has taken you through the similar path from the role of diplomacy and technology. And Antoine Half can introduce himself in a second. Durwood, your camera just went off. I'm not quite sure why. If that's the, oh, I see you're coming back on.
Right. There we go. Okay. There you go.
Let me get rid of your doppelganger there. Hold on a second. Okay, here we go. So Durwood, just because you've had such a long journey here, give us a general sense of where you think things are here as opposed to where they have been. Just describe a little bit of your background, how you became who you are right now in terms of methane. Durwood, could you hear me?
Okay, and for many, many decades. Yeah, yes, I can. Can you hear me, Andy?
Yes.
Andy, are we getting through to each other?
Yes.
Okay. I'm in a train station, and so
Okay.
my internet connection may be a little spotty, but I'm an international environmental lawyer, and I have been working this patch since 19 young Cameron and my late wife, Barbara Shaw. And we had funding in the very beginning to represent small island states who are threatened with sea level rise. Remember, this is 1989, just before the beginning of the UNF. In the client group, we helped organize what has now become, for many years, small island states. And we even had the arrogance to draft the first draft of the UNFCCC to get something out on the table.
Amazing.
I've moved on to yet another group that I founded called Sustainable Development, and our focus here is on the fast mitigation side of climate change. So climate is a problem of time and temperature. It's too hot, and we have too little time left to solve it. And when you look, CO2 can do when we decarbonize, as we have to do, we see that it does not turn down warming until about 2050, when it begins to avoid about 0.1 degree. Of course, we have to do this marathon to 2050 to decarbonize. And the decarbonization kicks in big time around 2060 and starts bending the warming curve down. But we also have to do the non-CO2 short-lived super pollutants, because when we cut those, then we get almost immediate reduction in warming. And by 2050, we get than we would get if we just did CO2. So it's a dual strategy: decarbonize as fast as possible, and that's a challenge, as we all know. But the technology, we're getting the funding, the financing, but it's not enough. We have to win the sprint in the next 10, 20 years, but in hydrofluorocarbons, which we are taking out under the world's best environmental treaty, and indeed the world's best climate treaty. And that's the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the stratosphere, ozone. That brilliant treaty has avoided an amount of warming today that otherwise would have equaled what CO2 is contributing, and that's about half.
So methane matters hugely here. And one of the challenges we'll hopefully get to
We'll
also
avoid
is,
2.5 degrees Celsius. This is the most recent paper in Science, and that's about 1.7 degrees by
I want to bring, you're breaking up a little bit. I'm going to bring in Antoine. So Antoine Half, you were on here a year ago from Glasgow.
Yeah, right.
You have an affiliation at Columbia, but your prime line of work is at Kairos, which is tracking methane emissions and helping to clarify, give some credibility to, what companies or other institutions do. Is that correct?
It is correct. Excuse me, but it's not limited to methane. We do track carbon emissions as well, forestry, carbon offsets. Sorry, there's a bit of background noise here. I'm sitting outside of the green zone, and some fountain is just coming on. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay. So
Can
we
you
measure
actually,
all sorts of things.
before you start, can you just sort of pan your camera around and show us where we are? Hold on 1 second. So,
So I'm
apparently I've
sitting
got a
by
pretty
a
bad
fountain in the
connection
heart of the
there,
green
Andy.
zone. Yeah.
hold on a second.
I'm going to try to move a bit because it's a
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, just give me a second.
So, yeah, show us around a little because before we get into the specifics, just give us a sense of the situation there.
You know, it's not easy to give you a good sense just by moving the camera around because this cup is unbelievably dispersed. Sharm el
Uh,
Sheikh is a resort that stretches over 40 kilometers plus, but the venue
oh, there's a break in the stream there, I think. Yep,
Okay,
you
can you hear
froze.
me?
You froze briefly, but you're good.
Okay. Yeah, what I was trying to say is it's a very, very dispersed COP. The venue is very widespread, and it's very difficult to have a sense of what's going on. You probably know more about what's going on at COP27 sitting in New York than I do sitting in Sharm el Sheikh.
Which is one reason I'm not there. As a journalist, I'm actually in Maine, in the state of Maine, where I live now,
Okay,
in
right.
Wabanaki territory. But, I remember racing around and around, whether it was The Hague or Copenhagen, trying to keep abreast of the situation on the ground is very hard. So being there, you deserve anyone who is there battle just for fortitude. So take us back then to your prime issue here is basically credibility and emissions, I guess. Is that correct?
Yeah, emissions, carbon offsets, and just the pace, the change in the fuel mix. We track the deployment of renewable energy like solar panels in the US. We track incumbent fuels that are so important because we're not going to replace them overnight, and they're very much needed, especially natural gas, to deal with the intermittency of renewables and to integrate renewables in the mix. So we try to do solid measurements, tracking of all these things using a combination of new technologies, satellite imaging, geolocation devices, sometimes social media posts, with artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the idea is, people often say you can't manage what you can't measure. That's very true, but it's not just that you need to measure things to manage them. You need the measurements to be accurate, to be independent, to be verifiable, and to be trustworthy. And you need to be able to hold various actors accountable for their emissions, be it industrial players or countries or other emitters. So that's the idea. And I think this concept is getting more play at the COP. It's increasingly central. And in the statements today by John Kerry and all the news about methane, satellite detections are taking pride of place. But what strikes me is that technology, even though we pay lip service to innovation very often, technology is still not very central at COP as a whole. I'm surprised by how little discussion there is of new, innovative nuclear technologies, new renewable energy technologies, and measurement tracking technologies such as we have developed.
Yeah, that's such a shame to me. And Durwood, I'm going to bring you back in a second, assuming the signal's okay, because it's become clear to me that even in the last 10 years, the capacity to impose transparency on countries to know where there's hotspots of methane emissions or even coal use. There's satellites tracking, the activity at coal-fired power plants. It's harder
We
for
do, yeah,
countries.
yeah.
Yeah, it's harder for countries to fudge their numbers, or companies. So it's a fundamental driver of ambition, really, unless I'm missing something. And Durwood, I'm going to unmute you to see what do you think about that. Obviously, with CFCs and the other ozone depleters, technology has played a critical role in what's possible. But what do you think about the general flow?
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with the last comments. I mean, we need to measure so we can manage, and we need to measure accurately. We're getting to the point where we can do that with methane, with both the bottom up with the cameras, the aerial flights, and now satellites. So this is hugely important for taking methane down. And so yes, and then for the uh, for the next step on technology, well, with the Montreal Protocol, technology's been central, and we have the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel, which is a great innovation in governance. It compiles, it analyzes, and it reports twice a year to the parties on what the available technologies are to replace the ones that are being phased out and what the costs are. So it's the the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel. And we don't have that same kind of focus on technology here at the UNFCCC. That's sad, because that's where the energy is. That's where the innovation is. That's where the excitement is, and the optimism we need to keep going.
What do you hold on? Antoine, you can unmute. What are the why do you think that is? Why do you think technology isn't foregrounded?
Andy, I've pondered for decades, why the world hasn't emulated the Montreal Protocol's success more than it has. I mean, this is a treaty that solved the first great threat to the global atmosphere by repairing the stratospheric ozone layer, and at the same time has done more to avoid warming than any other agreement. Up to today, it's avoided warming that otherwise would equal what CO2 is causing. That's remarkable. And by the end of the century, it'll be about 2.5 degrees Celsius of avoided warming by taking out the fluorinated gases, which are super climate pollutants, and by repairing stratospheric ozone and protecting sinks. That's almost 1 degree from protecting sinks. So you look at that sectoral agreement and its success, and you have to say, can't we use that same approach on other sectors? And the answer is yes, we certainly can. And we should do this with methane. We need a sectoral approach, and ultimately a global, binding global agreement. And the Biden team, Kerry, Biden, the whole team, Rick Duke, and so on, they have moved in this direction with the Global Methane Pledge, with the European Union, and now about 130 countries. And now these announcements that are going on right now are deepening that pledge and broadening it as well, because more countries are coming in. This is another critical step along the way to what must become a global methane agreement with mandatory obligations and robust implementation of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Absolutely a critical part. That means money as well.
Yeah, and I was kind of I was a methane skeptic, for a while, in the context of the primacy of carbon dioxide in reducing emissions, the long-term picture. But I've become much more focused on this reality myself as a journalist, and I think they're important things. One of the things that's being pushed now is methane removal. There's this whole there's been so much focus on carbon capture and storage, but methane removal actually seems to have greater potential. Certainly, again, on a short time scale. And Rob Jackson at Stanford and others, scientists who I've known for a very long time, are making a strong case there. Do you see signs of that, and Antoine? You too as well. What do you see?
Yeah, very much so. There's no doubt. I mean, methane in the short term is responsible for 50% of global warming. And as Durwood said, by removing this factor, we buy ourselves time to work out longer-term solutions to displace carbon. So it's indispensable to do it. We can't meet any kind of, assuming we can still meet the Paris goals. There's no way we can do it without eradicating big methane emissions in the first place. And then we need to do that. Also, doing that will give us time to work out longer-term solutions. I think that's getting more accepted. And the global methane pledge last year was one of the highlights of COP26, even though it was not a COP26 agreement per se. There was also the China-US joint declaration on climate, which also had a big emphasis on methane. And today we had some news about the moves in the US about strengthening methane standards, methane policies, and in the UN, the IMEO made an announcement about launching Mars, the platform to detect super emitters and try to alleviate them very quickly. So we're making headway. In some ways, I think it's not just about cooperation and international agreements. And as important as they are, I'm not sure they're sufficient to do the trick, because we've had a number of agreements. We've had 27 COPs, 27 years, and the emissions are still increasing. I think it may be important to get to the point where we have more competition. There's going to be some noise here because I'm just under the path of a.
That's okay.
But I think it's going to be. We're going to get to a point where individual progress by country is going to be very important, especially the US and European countries. And then the imposition of CBAMs, of border of price mechanisms to impose a penalty on imports deemed to come with a high methane footprint. I think that has a potential to really start moving the needle in a big way. And so cooperation is very big, but competition and coercion and enforcement is also very important.
Well, and isn't this also, particularly for methane, where you have so many dispersed, distributed sources, especially the agriculture sector, the idea of removal, if there's a catalytic or other process that can get, to scale, relevant scale, you're talking about a way to really compensate for those emission sources that just focus on the thing that matters, which is the concentration of this substance in the atmosphere, right?
Yeah, the big ones from the oil and gas industry and also coal are the low-hanging fruits. They're very concentrated, they're very damaging, they're very easy to abate. Coal is making progress. Our company, Kairos, issued a report recently, just a couple of days ago, measuring the performance of various fossil fuel producers over the last year since the global methane pledge announcement last year at Glasgow. And the only country that made significant progress is Australia. Australia had a terrible footprint, which was much greater than was reflected in the national inventory in the stock take of Australia. And Australia pushed back against satellite measurements initially. But in the last year, they've made a huge amount of progress, and they removed a lot of emissions from the coal sector, from the Bowen Basin. So it can be done. The technology exists. In the coal industry, it was traditionally applied to avoid explosion risks, but it can be applied more systematically to reduce methane emissions for climate purposes.
And Derwood, what's your take on this? I do think sometimes I've seen kind of people get so caught up in a particular policy that they miss the big goal. This happened with carbon tax for a long time, and it became such a focus. Hundreds of millions of dollars of campaign money went into that, and it's never too late to start afresh, I suppose. But I don't want to go back to wouldn't it have been great if?
Right. Well, a couple of comments. So, Andy, you mentioned earlier that you were a bit of a skeptic on methane in the early days, and I'm very glad to hear how you're evolving on this, because this is critical. We have to make sure that the people who understand CO2 understand its limitations. So when you decarbonize, you shut down a fossil fuel plant, you're not just stopping CO2, but you're stopping co-emitted sulfates as well. They're masking about 0.5 degrees Celsius of existing warming. So you are causing near-term warming for 10 years. 20 years, it's a wash. 30 years, the most aggressive decarbonization to get to net zero will avoid 0.1 degree Celsius of warming. So you have to look at the non-CO2 side as well. And you see it can do at least 4 times as much by 2050. And it can do the most in the next 10 to 20 years. So this window, somewhere, it could be less than 10, when we break through the 1.5 barrier, and we're going to see the 6 tipping points that are lurking right beyond 1.5, and they will include the self-reinforcing feedbacks that will further accelerate warming. So we are right on the edge of complete loss of control if we don't radically cut both the CO2, decarbonize even faster, and do the non-CO2. So anyway, that's one point. The methane removal, I like what Rob Jackson is doing and Renaud de Richter and the other scientists. It has incredible potential. They say it could avoid up to 0.6 degrees of future warming in the relative near term. We understand the physics and the chemistry. Can we perfect technology to do this? And there are several options. So that's a huge R&D opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you think of 0.6 degrees, when we're battling every 10th of a degree, that's worth trillions of dollars in avoided damage to the world. And what does that justify for R&D? A lot of money. They should put that in. So, and the other reason that this is important, not just because agriculture is a little tricky, but because 40 to 50% of methane emissions are natural sources. And we're getting those to increase as we warm the world. So we warm up the tropics, the wetlands start releasing more methane. So we damn well better learn how to take methane out faster. There was a brilliant headline, and I think it was Grist, I can't remember for sure, when the global methane assessment came out of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and UNEP last year. And it said, cut methane or die. Any questions? And that's the way I look at this. This is
Wow.
what can keep us relatively safe by time, if you want to use that. And yes, it does, as we perfect our other strategies. So I see this as three races. There's a sprint that we have to win right now in the next 10, maybe 15 years to cut the non-CO2 superpollutants. That includes the HFCs under the Kigali Amendment. It includes black carbon soot. It includes tropospheric ozone and methane, which is the single biggest and fastest of all of those right now. Then you have to win the marathon to 2050. That's decarbonization. We're doing that. We're doing well, but we got to speed it up because the legacy of fossil fuels otherwise would kill us. And then you've got to ultimately run an ultra marathon, learn how to pull CO2 out, learn how to pull methane out, and restore the climate. So climate restoration is our real goal.
Yeah, and I want to ask you both. And there are a couple of journalists who'll be joining us soon if the plan holds. I think some of the resistance from some environmentalists here is that this can be used as a sort of part of the justification for continued use of natural gas. The idea that you can have gas still in the energy mix that's certified to be contributing less to warming. I'm with that because I see, especially in developing countries, a vital role for more natural gas production, even while we cut back in rich countries. Is there any merit to the argument that's out there that anything that perpetuates the use of fossil gas, natural gas, methane, whatever you want to call it, has to stop? Maybe Antoine, I don't know if you want to get at that.
Yeah, no merit whatsoever from where I stand, for various reasons. I mean, first of all, we can't get rid of natural gas overnight, even if we wanted to. And the crisis with Russian imports is really highlighting this. Second, natural gas is really a much cleaner fuel if it doesn't come with methane emissions. If it does come with methane, then it's a problem. It can be as bad as coal. But if it's clean and that's achievable, then it's a huge improvement on what we have on other fossil fuels. And then the third thing is that it's not a huge investment. You're not committing dollars. That you don't need 20 years to get returns on investment if you invest to remove methane from natural gas. In fact, very often it can be done almost immediately, and it brings revenue, especially at today's gas prices. So it's not it doesn't lock in natural gas as a long-term fuel necessarily, because it's not something that needs years or decades to get payback on investment. It's not a huge lift. It's very easy to do. And with the, it makes you wonder why it's not done yet and why it hasn't been done before. And I think the reason is simply that nobody could see it, nobody knew. And countries that are gas rich found it easy to, or oil rich, and for which gas is a byproduct, found it just easy to let the gas out in the atmosphere. And there was no incentive, no financial incentive, no reputational cost with doing this. And that's changing now that there's scrutiny and public scrutiny on emissions. And it's not just private measurements that companies do and use in their self-reporting that can be very biased. It's also just independent, verifiable measurements that can be done by satellites without getting the permission of the operators. And that really bring transparency and standardized measurements across the industry.
Yeah, and I'm also, by the way, before you go on, Derwent, I want to mention the ethical point too. I wrote last year at Glasgow, and since then had several conversations here about energy and emissions equity. Here was the vice president of Nigeria, was among many African leaders in recent months who made the ethical, moral case for having access to that energy and the economic activity that results, unless any abatement question would be who pays for it, but there's a fundamental right to that resource in countries that haven't contributed anything to warming yet.
Right.
Is that also part of the mix?
That's a big theme here in,
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I agree with these comments. I would like to get out of all fossil fuels as fast as possible. You got to have a replacement source of energy. So it's the pace has to do with how fast we do clean energy. That's critical. You cannot tell people they can't have energy. And the equity question is very powerful. How do you tell Macky Sall in Senegal? How do you tell Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados they can't develop their gas reserves? I think what you can tell them is we really would like you to ensure that the companies that come in to develop those gas fields commit to the lowest methane intensity possible. Now, there are voluntary measures right now. Many companies say they can meet very, very low methane intensity, well below 0.2, aiming to some companies are saying even down to 0.02%. So that's got to be the goal. And again, the comment just previously that we're going to use gas for a decade, 2 decades, maybe longer. And if you don't stop the methane leaks during that period, we lose control of the climate system. So it's something we're going to have to make sure we have the lowest methane intensity. And that should be a competitive advantage. And also how the public companies keep their social license. If they don't do the methane job, they should be the first to go out of business.
Yeah, I want to answer. There's a comment that's come in from Ann Caruso. I think it's probably directed at me because of what I just said. Are you paid by fossil fuel industry? It's been proven that there's no effective way to stop leakage of natural gas when drilling and harvesting natural gas. I'm so disheartened to hear you because you present as unbiased scientists. Well, let me just talk from my own standpoint as a journalist. The case I have written about for developing countries with zero energy at scale, with no way for people to cook except on firewood. I've been in huts in India and in urban settlements in Nairobi where people are relying on charcoal to cook their evening meals when they could be cooking on LPG, which could even be under your backyard grill, where maybe not. But for us in the developed world to say you can't have access to any of these fuels, to me, is fundamentally unethical unless we are willing to pay for it completely, and we're not. So that's my standpoint on natural gas. And here in the United States, I wrote about fracking a lot. There are ways to do better. It's good to see the Biden administration cracking down finally with what look like some new regulations on keeping the methane in the pipeline while we use this material. And so that's kind of my standpoint. I don't know if anyone else wants to discuss that comment, which is,
sure,
a frequent position.
I'm I'm challenged by the comment to make sure that we understand the technology and that we can measure it. So this gets back to what the satellites can do, the overflights and the handheld cameras. We will be able to tell whether the technology is working. And if it's not, then we're going to change our position. But if it is working, then we're going to say, keep that methane intensity progressively lower and lower.
Yeah. I agree. And just to Anne again, she has a comment here about India. India can transition to renewables. That argument is old. Well, it will take India decades to transition to renewables. And what are we doing for the 100 million families in India who still cook on biomass right now, where women or children go out in the fields every day to collect firewood 2 or 3 times a day to cook food, heat, water for baths, using women's energy to collect wood, to be subject to abuse when they're doing it. That to me is an energy crisis that justifies using whatever fuel they have handy. And it can be electric. There are parts of India where there's reliable electricity and induction cooking can happen. There are parts of India where that will take decades. And I'm not about waiting for, I think it's fundamentally unethical to say that India, for example, India subsidizes LPG, propane, for the poor. They took away a subsidy from the middle class. And the middle class said, okay, as long as you can reliably give that to the poor so they get their LPG to cook on, the blue flame that goes on and off, that doesn't require women to go spend hours in fields collecting material to burn in smoky fires that are shortening their lives. So India, the transition is essential as it is everywhere. It's just that it will take time. And I don't think we have the right to deny them the options they have right now. That's just me talking. Antoine, Antoine is back. I think we're going to stop the methane discussion here. I'm going to do a little bit of a roundup of what's going on elsewhere at the COP. If you want to hang in there for a little while longer, Antoine and Durwood, that's great. But this is really an important point. I think the role of technology as a facilitator of diplomacy has become clearer and clearer, even if it's not yet ingrained in the diplomacy. And so hopefully countries will understand that R&D and development and demonstration of these technologies and finding a way to, as Antoine is working on, to make it part of the profit-making side of the energy business, to demonstrably produce these energy more cleanly with a lower climate footprint, to be able to monetize that feels like an important part of the way forward. So maybe a last thought from Antoine before you head back into the COP swirl.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I agree completely with the comments you just made. And the only thing I would add is satellite imaging is not really something that the industry embraced, because we're not a PR exercise in favor of the status quo. I think new measurements from aerial surveys as well and satellite sensors have shown that the industry was emitting much more than was previously disclosed and was estimated using emission factors and spreadsheet calculations. And the industry has been pushing back initially. Now the science is very robust. There's been different labs looking at the same data or different data coming to similar conclusions. There's been a lot of peer-reviewed studies. We published papers in Science, in Nature, that have been peer-reviewed. So it's now, I think, very established that the accuracy, the reliability of satellite measurements is very established. And that's starting to be now reflected in policy, both the IMEO announcement today and the EPA move to strengthen the methane regulations as well. So I think that those are positive developments, and civil society is also empowered now to hold companies and countries accountable for their emissions. It's no longer something that we depend on self-reporting by companies to find out about. There is a way to monitor independently, and that holds the promise of dramatically reducing the footprint. The fastest reduction in greenhouse gases that we can achieve in the short run and on a large scale is really from the industry itself. Because it's part of the problem, it's also part of the solution, and we can't just get rid of it immediately.
That sounds fair to me. So good luck to both of you there in Sharm el
So,
Sheikh. Sorry, or Durwood?
but just a final comment, I wanted to say that there are two companies in Sharm el Sheikh right now doing methane. One is an investment firm called Full Cycle. They're putting their money into methane abatement to make money, okay? And they already have several investments going. So I'd look for those folks. And then SOP from Milan, Italy. Great company that is doing methane mitigation in the agricultural sector. Done it for many, many years successfully with dairy farms, manure lagoons, and it helps improve the profitability of the dairy farms. They're doing it for vineyards, they're doing it for rice paddies. So this is happening when you look at the technology, and we just need policy to speed it way up.
That's just great. Well, actually, I'm going to show there's a UN report I see here that's useful. Let me just show that too before we move on. Hold on a second. Present, share screen. Getting there. Here. Yeah, so this is International Methane Emissions Observatory 2022 report. One last question I have for you both is thinking of the scale of investment in CO2 policy. Is this an order of magnitude problem? Is the methane stuff still way down the list of what's in the mix? It gets a lot of eyeballs, momentarily, but is it remotely in the same where it needs to be?
No, it's not. And there was a study commissioned by the Global Methane Hub, which is a philanthropic effort capitalizing $340 million to speed methane mitigation and I hope removal as well. But that report said of all the climate investment, methane is getting about something less than 2%. Okay,
Wow.
and if it's half of past warming and much more of future avoided warming, it needs to get a lot more money. It is worth trillions of dollars in avoided damage, keeping civilization relatively safe.
At the same time, I agree with that fully, but at the same time, I'm not sure that the amount of dollars invested in methane abatement is the right benchmark, is the right metric, because it doesn't cost that much. It's not so costly to remove methane.
Yeah, take a wrench, and tighten your leaks,
Right.
and do capture it at your landfills. Manage your dairy farms better. I mean, this can all be done, and it can be done fast.
Great. Well, and here's that. It's globalmethanehub.org for those who want to learn more. There's a website that is sort of a clearinghouse for this discussion. And I think what Antoine mentioned about the low cost relatively and the simplicity sometimes is something that people miss. And again, it is a quick win. If you think we're already at this juncture to really unhinged levels of warming, shaving off a half a degree or the like in the near term is really an important part of the process. So thanks to both of you, Durwood Zelke, Antoine Half. People can go to the website, and I'll be go to wherever you're watching. You'll see the information on both of you. There are some journalists who are going to come on, I think, in a little while. They're at a briefing. I'm going to keep on here a little while to explore some of the Biden administration moves and other news. Thanks for being here, and I'll check back in with you maybe in a week.
Thank you, Andy.
See how things have gone.
Thanks, Andy.
A bientôt.
Bye-bye.
Well, sorry about the some of the audio issues. It's being at these facilities, being at these conferences is it's really hard, and it's noisy, and it's and the rest. I'm going to look back through the comments here to see who else is speaking. Kimberly Lentros, Business Insider. China sets aside millions to control the rain. Oh, this is weather, managing the weather. I wrote a book with my wife, Lisa McKaylee, on the history of human, our relationship with weather and climate. And there was a section on weather modification. It gets a lot of money. It gets a lot of investment in places like China, but it's not clear it does much. It's still not clear, despite the money. So, and that leads to the questions of geoengineering, which I've written a lot about. Cool the climate in a way that's reliable and safe. I'm hoping that we don't need to go there. At some point, humans will be managing our relationship with the atmosphere in a two-way way, meaning limiting warming, not just by limiting gases flowing, but doing other things. I don't think we're nearly to that point yet. Let's go over to Twitter and see what's going on. I'm just going to check in to see if the Biden administration, President Biden's remarks, I think, are a little later than now. I'm hoping that the journalists I had invited can come on the show. I know, again, that these conferences are really hard to navigate. They're probably at briefings. There's a couple other things I wanted to bring up here, though. One is the human rights issues. I was really glad to see Naomi Klein, who's chosen not to go. Let me just pull this up on screen so you can see what I'm looking at. Naomi is a very much followed writer and campaigner for climate justice, climate action. And here we go. She has been part of a coalition of folks who are trying to raise the attention in COP27 to the grotesque human rights violations in Egypt that are unfolding and have been unfolding well before this conference. Egypt Unsilenced. It's the Egypt Unsilenced Collective. If you are on Twitter, like I am, and I encourage you to stick with it if you're there, you can see a lot of what she's been posting. News coverage has framed the Free Allah campaign and struggles for human rights as overshadowing climate negotiations. They're actually fundamentally part of climate negotiations. That, as this line says here, there can be no just action on climate without social justice and without a just society. Otherwise, you could have onerous climate change actions. This is this idea of maladaptation or malmitigation that could fundamentally trample people's rights. This has happened in India, where farmers have had their land taken over by solar farms. This comment here, let me see if I've got this set up so you can hear it. Hopefully you can hear what Hossam Bhagat says here. Hossam is executive director of this human rights group, a personal rights group, and he has a large following in the Middle East for his commentary. So let me just play this little clip because I think it's important. I think you should be able to hear it. Hold on.
Our key message, and in the build-up to COP27, and especially in the last few days, of course, our key message and that of the most prominent environmental justice and climate justice activists, the slogan has been, there is no climate justice without human rights. And many people, especially in Egypt, think that that was just our excuse to be here, that we're just trying to find an in to a climate conversation in order to put human rights on the agenda. But let me tell you, I work for a human rights organization that this year celebrates its 20th anniversary. We started as a mainstream human rights organization working on your typical civil liberties, criminal justice, and economic and social rights issues. 10 years ago, we started doing environmental justice work. And that was because the Egyptian people 10 years ago started actually organizing, started exercising the right to association, to organizing, to challenging government policies.
And let me go back to the thread here. Hold on a second. This is a key point. An unjust world with or without climate change is a place I oh I that's a good Linda Tofte, reduce omissions. Yes, well if you omit human rights in these in these conferences, then you really are then you really are providing no pathway to a world that's truly sustainable. Let me go back to the flow here. Here's quite often young activists are invited to these conferences. It's a little performative and a little exploitative in some ways because all these guys in their white suits get to sit there and listen to.
Let the African COP be an action COP. Politicians, when you stand up to talk, my generation requests that speak like there is an emergency. Speak like you are not barren. Act like you have an access on Earth, because this is the only planet where we're going to carry on your legacy as your children. Men in office, how are you going to be remembered? You wish to be remembered as one who did a lot of nothing while in power?
It's certainly a
Let
good
the
question.
African COP
Sorry.
be an action COP. Politicians,
Hold
when
on.
you stand
I have
up
to
to
stop that.
talk, my
Well, Kalain Hussein.
Apologies for the very late delay, my tardiness.
No, God, as I said earlier, I've done this. I've been to this rodeo,
Yeah,
and it's a nightmare. And actually, Antoine Half, who was on before, said that COP27 is particularly challenging because it's very spread out.
spread out, little signage, meetings delayed, going over. It is quite a rodeo.
Oh my God! So tell everyone, tell us who you are and what's your orientation as you're reporting on this big meeting.
Yeah, not a problem. So my name is Kalain Hussein. I am a journalist and weather anchor at Guardian Media Limited, which is a media house in Trinidad and Tobago. I am here at COP27 with a fellowship from the Stanley Center for Peace and Security and the Earth Journalism Network. So physically on site for the next, well, 10 days now again.
Wow.
It's been quite a wild ride.
My first big magazine article way back in 1983 took me to Trinidad and Tobago. Well, to Trinidad.
Wow.
It was
Okay.
about an herbicide. It was about paraquat, which was a weed killer, somewhat like Roundup, and it was.
Right.
Actually, I've got the copy of it right here. 1983. It was a global company, ICI, a British company. The compound was very popular. It's being used as a very effective weed killer that didn't persist in the environment, which is a good thing. But it was killing a lot of people because it was a brown liquid. And once it got out of the conventional bottle, it got into people's homes and people drank it accidentally. Sometimes suicide was used for suicide, which is a horrible thing. But it was actually a really big story about. Here's that piece. I just happen to have it right here.
Wow.
There was see if I can show you
Huh.
the. Oh, here, yeah.
Yeah.
It was being used improperly.
Hmm.
So we think about all the sort of issues around COP27 and the climate talks about developing world, big companies, responsibility, ethics. It's part of that same story of global development. It's
Yep.
really interesting. And I loved being in Trinidad. It was a sad reason to be there, but it's a great place. So how do you convey the story to listeners back in Trinidad? I know it's hard. American weather presenters have become a pretty interesting source of climate information, along with what's happening with
Yeah.
hurricanes.
Yeah. I mean, I have sort of taken on the role of not only just doing the weather every night, but also being a climate journalist, weather, environment, and climate. And I cover that for not only television, but for print, for our digital platforms, for radio, for podcasts. So it's a lot of different arms that I can use to get that story across, right? But a lot of what I do specifically, because I'm really focused on the weather, it will be linking extreme weather events that we experience, the devastation from that, from coastal erosion, floods, all of that, to what climate change actually is. So I'll be able to insert, the floods are definitely because of uh, bad development and poor planning, but also the amount of rainfall that we experience in a short space of time has increased, and that's because of climate change. So trying to link in those little tidbits of information so that when people go out there, they can spread those tidbits of information and be like, I know something about climate change. And also, getting the ability to do projects like these and have to do deep dives and explanatory reporting, also things that help get that climate change story out into the general public.
Yeah, and I think, I've done some training for journalists in developing countries and here, in which I try to illuminate that focusing on the vulnerability side, meaning development, the having poor households in areas that are vulnerable to flooding,
Yeah,
is something you can work on the ground. It's just as important as the work happening in these COPs on
yeah,
climate, slowing climate change, but reducing climate vulnerability is something that every community can do. And I think it builds the conversation toward the bigger picture. So what you do is
definitely.
invaluable.
Yeah,
And so here I'm showing Climate Tracker, which has some of the output from some of the your colleagues. And are you on
yeah.
this site yet?
No. So I would be on the Earth Journalism website.
Right. We'll go there
Yeah,
too.
yeah. But I know I actually have some of my colleagues who are from Trinidad actually with partnering with Climate Tracker COP27. So I see some of the names that I recognize on there, like Tyrell Gittins, and you might see one from Ryan Beechu as well. Yeah, they are from Trinidad.
Well, it's such a great community, and I think one of the best things about getting journalists to the COPs is that you can meet each other and create a sort
Yeah,
of
for sure,
the.
definitely.
I, if anyone out there doesn't know about the Earth Journalism Network, it's more than 15 years old. James Fawn, the founder, is just driven by not only connecting journalists around the world in conversations around how to cover the environment more effectively, but also sometimes helping devise new ways to do that. The concept of geojournalism, the networks that have emerged from Earth Journalism Network, Info Amazonia, Info Congo, the Third Pole, are really fundamentally new ways of covering issues in a regional way that didn't exist before. So it's a great organization. And I'm
Yeah,
showing
and
here
Jane.
the, sorry.
Yeah, James and his team really have been invaluable to our coverage here. They've given us so much help with the direction that we can take, the just how we can shape our stories, how to even just cover COP, because COP can be, and I can tell you, overwhelming with the amount of events that are happening simultaneously, and you're trying to fit time in between to write your stories and do interviews on top of all the side events and press events. Like right now, I know President Biden is speaking. So after we finish this call, I have to go see
Yeah.
what he said. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to see, I actually have him queued up here. So if and when he speaks, I've got the video waiting to show.
Ah, okay, okay. So he hasn't started yet. Great.
What's your sense of the when you look around there? Yeah, here. Oh, well, maybe. Oh, it looks like it might be getting ready to
Still waiting
happen.
for you.
Um, what are the big stories? What are the big themes that are there? I know about
Yeah.
loss and damage, of
So
course, but
yeah, so at this COP, I'm seeing a lot of obviously loss and damage, and that is something that I'm focusing on. But I just came out of a talk on the Early Warnings for All initiative that's being led for the next 5 years. We want to have everybody under the sun under an early warning system, and that is one of the low-hanging fruit of the adaptation measures that can be done. So the United Nations will be spending just over $3 billion in the next 5 years to get every single nation in the world under an early warning system. Something else that has definitely taken center stage at this particular COP has been youth and youth involvement in climate change. I've also been seeing a lot of indigenous either side events or pavilions. So the indigenous people have definitely been at the forefront of this COP, and it seems that challenges aside, from the Egyptian COP, with the number of people that's been involved, it seems like a bit more inclusive compared to what I've seen prior. Um, and this is when I say what I've seen online prior, because this is my first COP, like I said. Um, there's a huge push for the different arms of climate financing as well for adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage. And like I said, loss and damage is the one that I'm chiefly focused on. I live
Sure.
in a small island developing states. We have bilateral negotiations from the G77 plus China and the Alliance of Small Island States. So three big negotiating blocks there. Um, and the outcomes of that will definitely have significant impacts for not only Trinidad and Tobago, but the Eastern Caribbean at large. So lots to follow up on in the coming days.
Yeah, and that got I saw some new financing models emerge the last couple of days too for how to handle the loss and damage question. It seems that there
Yeah.
could be some progress there. I was tweeting the other day about I don't see much prospect of this becoming sort of we just had a hurricane, here's the bill. I,
No, no. Yeah, I asked a couple people about that today, actually. What does loss and damage look like? And none of them can really give me a clear answer. So it seems like the negotiators themselves are trying to figure out what that will look like when the loss and damage fund is finally financed. And there's still quite a bit of contention, even though loss and damage is on the agenda, as how that loss and damage fund will actually be financed. Two of the proposals, well, one proposal that was put forward by AOSIS and was echoed by Prime Minister Mia Mottley would have been doing taxing the profits, not the revenue, the profits of oil and gas or fossil fuel companies. But when I asked my negotiators and my delegation about that today, given that Trinidad and Tobago is primarily an oil and gas economy, a lot of
right.
our revenue comes from oil and gas, they shied away from giving a direct answer because that tax will have detrimental impacts on whether oil and gas companies continue to invest in economies, emerging economies like Trinidad and Tobago and other places like Nigeria and African countries as well. So it will be interesting to see which other countries around the world, especially those that are heavily oil and gas economy based, will they sign on to this or will they disagree?
Or will there be some kind of what would you call it, a factor that for depending on the country's state of
Yeah,
development
yeah. I
limits
mean,
their taxation?
it remains to be seen, right? And I mean,
Yeah,
it's only when I spoke to the Prime Minister Gaston Brown 2 days ago, and this today would have been my delegation. All the talks so far have been informal, nothing formally yet for loss and damage.
yeah. And there, by the way, the other challenge is, and this is something I've written about, the science is still complicated. When it's becoming possible to measure how much of a storm was the result of the added heating from carbon dioxide. But when you look at the
Yeah.
losses from the storm, meaning how many houses were swept away, how many people were killed, that a lot of that's a function of vulnerability on the ground
Hmm.
that was built. Pakistan had a fraction of the population it has now in 1970.
Yeah,
So if the same flood had happened in 1970, it would have been, vastly less
exactly.
damage.
A lot of it
So,
has to do with the development of the country, and these disasters are happening over the same area, but the development has created impermeable ground. So where's the water going to go but up?
right. In that issue, I wouldn't mind tracking and maybe writing something on my Substack blog about the specifics of Trinidad. I think you've just hit on how this gets complicated very quickly just by looking at Trinidad specifically. Small island developing state reliant on a fossil fuel for
Mhm.
its economic engine. How does that play with all of these
Yeah,
questions?
and as we speak right now, over the last 3 days and continuing today, Trinidad has experienced severe flooding for the fourth time in less than a month.
Wow.
And a house was actually lost into the ocean because of coastal erosion simultaneously while these floods were happening. And people who have lived in certain areas for 70 plus years say they've never experienced things like this. Um, So we are seeing the effects of climate change. We are seeing the effects of development. We are seeing the effects of changes in land use. We are seeing the effects of population changes in certain areas that were previously floodplains. All of that play out.
Yeah, I'm just showing here some of the local coverage right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is happening everywhere. One of those weirdest paradoxes I wrote about a year ago was a global study showing that people worldwide are still moving into zones of flood risk faster than flooding is changing. In other words, we're moving into these areas because of the economic activity, coastal areas are where things
Yeah, I
happen.
I think I was trying to explain this to another foreign journalist, that when Trinidad began seeing settlements, everyone lived near the water sources. So that would either be by the coast or along rivers. And then as the years progressed, we never had a planning ministry or a ministry or arm of the government that regulated planning, uh, so strictly that prevented people from building in floodplains. And they're called floodplains for a reason. So now you have all of these expensive developments that are quite literally on riverbanks, and they are the communities that are being affected.
Oh my God. Well,
Yep.
that just shows you there's so much work to be done.
Yeah.
There's one argument that's floated. Three analysts at the Breakthrough Institute, who've tracked climate policy for a long time, did a kind of a manifesto on the merits of funding advancing development. In other words, funding basic economic development in poor countries as a path to climate progress allows you to build more robustness, more resilience. Of course, it has to be equitable and getting people out of poverty, and can advance energy systems more quickly. And it avoids all these arguments about like how much of this is climate funding, fitting it into the climate lens, as opposed to just, if we want a sustainable planet with 9 billion people all living decent lives by 2050, what can we and the established powers and sources of finance around the world do to build that capacity where it's needed most? It feels like it takes this question to a very basic level, and I'll be doing some thinking about that in the coming months too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that regard, countries would have to go to development banks to get financing for that, right? I know
Yeah.
that specifically for Trinidad and Tobago, there are like adaptation projects that are being done in these flood-prone areas, specifically the South Oropouche River Basin. So home to about 200,000 people. They get typically flooded about 10 times a year. But the floods now have been lasting longer, waters have been higher. So they got funding through the Adaptation Fund, and now projects are being done very community based to make that entire river basin more resilient to flooding and adapt and put some mitigation measures in place.
Wow. So, are you part of a conversation with others who have a similar position? I don't know if you know Jeff Burrodelli, who's an American meteorologist, who TV presenter, who's also become very active as a climate communicator. Within that world of people who who cover weather and disasters, as well as climate. There's quite a conversation, I think, globally. I don't know if you're part of that.
Well, I haven't. But what I would say is that it's a very thin line we all have to walk when we're trying to attribute weather events to climate. And that is a whole new emerging science, climate attribution. And there's actually a website online called Climate Attribution, where a group of scientists from around the world look at extreme weather events and give an analysis on how climate change have actually caused this event to be worse. And will give you the facts and figures associated with that. What I try to do, at least in my reporting, is look at what the trends have been over the last 30 years, 60 years, what I have data for, and what the National Meteorology Service would have provided, and link it to the weather that we are experiencing today. So let's say, for example, It was 34 degrees Celsius today, so that's about close to between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. How common is that in our climate change process? Are we seeing hotter temperatures? Is this record breaking? Is this a climate change induced thing? Are we going to be seeing more hot temperatures like this in earlier months and later months when we typically see cooler temperatures? So looking at the trends over the last couple of decades and attributing it, or at least linking it to what we're experiencing now, I think is one of the effective ways I've tried to, link the climate change into the day-to-day life.
And I don't want to keep you away from your reporting duties there too long, but just one last question. How important to you is social media and in building your relationship with your audience and making any
Exceptionally
progress?
important. Yeah, exceptionally important. I mean, social media has allowed, I mean, people on social media, and then when they see you on television, it feels like you've developed a relationship with this person that generally isn't accessible. Once you do that, you build trust. And building trust is a very, very important thing. When you're trying to communicate complex information, you are seen as a credible source of information. You essentially, and it gives you an opportunity to disseminate information in a way that isn't usually disseminated, right?
Right.
So I think social media is exceptionally important, especially in times of crisis. A lot of people, specifically in Trinidad and Tobago, when it's raining, they flock to Facebook, they flock to Twitter to find out what's coming out of the Met services and other official or reputable sources of information for weather and that kind of thing. So utilizing social media, leveraging your following, your position on social media, I think is exceptionally important, especially in the age of extreme weather.
What's your take on Twitter right now? I hope you're
Oh
staying
boy.
on. I'm staying on.
I think I will stay on. I definitely want Mr. Musk to let us know when the last day is, so before they shut it down.
Or
But
before he blows it up.
before he blows it up. Yeah, that's true. Um, I'm staying on for now. I still think it's a valuable source of information. I mean, a lot of journalists use it to disseminate information and breaking news. Um, in Trinidad, Facebook is king
Mm.
for information and where people go to find information. So Facebook isn't going anywhere. Twitter was emerging, but we'll see what happens in the coming months or maybe even a year if the Twitter does declare bankruptcy.
I want to show you one thing. There's a guy
Mhm.
who works at Twitter who used to have an independent shop building tools to track flash flooding. His name is Jim Moffat. His Twitter handle is at
Right.
Snowman. He worked with people in Jakarta, the mega city in Indonesia, on a way to use Twitter data through an app to track flash flooding in a live way, where the amount of tweeting by people, hey, there's a flooded street here, was going into an analytical tool that would help clarify the map of this sprawling city. And also information then goes out to people on where to evacuate and the like. And I think this to me shows you the potential of Twitter that sometimes people don't really absorb. It's a source of data. I'm just showing you that what happened for Jakarta. I don't know whether that would be
Yeah.
useful for uh, some of the towns and cities in Trinidad, but it feels like this is still an arena that sometimes people don't
Yeah, I mean,
absorb.
this particular tool is very useful. But in Trinidad, when it comes to flood reporting and like information like this, it would be very difficult to adapt a Twitter API to that because a lot of people will post those reports on WhatsApp and on Facebook. Very
Right.
difficult to actually automate. But so I founded Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center in 2014, separate from my current job.
Hmm.
And what that managed to do build a following of everybody on the ground. It has a following of, honestly, I haven't checked the latest numbers, but I would say around like 180,000, maybe a little bit more on Facebook. Just over, it has a couple thousand people across many of the different platforms. And
Wow.
yeah, it has done fairly well for itself. And during high impact weather events, we see like a reach of up to 2-3 million. So you get a lot of reach there. And what that has allowed me to do is when there's an inclement weather event, people will send videos and pictures and reports of these are the areas that are flooding. And then my team would be able to collate all of those reports and post it onto the social media platforms to, inform other people of what exactly is going on across the entire country. And it's honestly, I can tell you certainly that this platform has been used by journalists, by people who commute across the entire country, drivers, parents who are deciding whether they want to send their children to school. It really has been used by a lot of people across many different sectors, including the government. So yeah, what you're seeing there
Wow.
is one of the major rivers yesterday, the banks actually breached, and it is flooding parts of southern Trinidad. Instead of the water going out to sea. So
Mm.
yeah, it's not a great scene in that particular area.
Well, boy, I'll tell you, we should do a follow-up webcast just on this when you're back.
Not a problem. Not a
And
problem.
I could maybe I'm planning to have Jim Moffat on if he's still employed at Twitter. The idea of the role of Facebook and WhatsApp and these other tools
Yeah.
in building community resilience, and also integrating understanding of how climate change relates is so important. Yeah, I see like 185,000 people like this, 200,000 people follow. What a fantastic innovation. So you say
Yeah.
you created this?
Yeah. I created this 2014. It really took off in 2017, and the following just continued to grow from there.
Fantastic. Well, I wish you luck there at the COP.
Thank you.
And at the same time, I'm really glad to spread the work you're doing back home, which I think is, again, this idea of what we can do locally or with technology to really change outcomes for people in real time.
Yeah.
Just as we work on the big tangle of climate change, which will take time. It's not a quick fix, as I've learned in 35 years of reporting. This kind of innovation, Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center, feels like a crucial part of where we go from here. So thanks for being
Thank you very much.
part of the
Thank you very
show.
much for having me. Yeah. All
Elaine
right.
Hussein from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, a small island state that's also a fossil energy economy for the time being. There at the COP27 talks in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. If we can possibly replicate this a week from today, Friday, that would be great. It's a day, I'll tell you, next Friday is seen as like the penultimate moment, but there's a lot of downtime
Okay.
because
Okay.
everybody's hunkered down, and it always goes to the following day. If
Okay.
the gavel will probably come on Saturday of that week, and so hopefully we'll have time to get you back on the
No
show.
problem. Yeah. I'll try to accommodate you, of course. All right.
Okay, and
Thank
I'm
you
going
for
to check.
having me.
So
All right.
thanks again, and we'll check
No
back in
problem.
to see. I may stay on here a little longer to see when President Biden
Not a problem.
delivers his
All
remarks.
right. Take care. Bye.
Be well. So what a great little conversation that was, showing the capacity, the importance of reporting on these treaty talks can't be understated. Okay, Doug Grant, post his name and URL. I will do that right now. Here's his weather center. So that's the Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center, facebook.com, TT Weather Center, which is what Hussein created back home in Trinidad and Tobago. You can find him at his, thank you, Janice Sushi. Track him down on Twitter. I'll throw his info back up on the main screen here too, so people can follow him on Twitter or get in touch with him. Where are we here? I've lost his. We'll get there. Hold on. Present. Stop screen. Thanks for being here today. As always, you're a big part of what I'm trying to do as the audience. If you share this with others later, that would be great. It gets archived right away. This is the earthjournalism.net homepage. Oops, I'll get there. I had the wrong one. Share screen. Here we go. So you'll find some of his work there eventually, and his, I think I've got his Twitter account here. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Kalain Hussein. It's KALAINH @ on Twitter. And what an innovative and interesting young man. Great to see what he's doing, both at home and there. Sachi, thank you, Janice, Sachi. And Doug, thank you for being here always. Let me just scan the internets one more time to see if there's anything more to share from COP. I think everyone's probably just getting situated for President Biden. And here, as I said earlier, this issue, if you haven't followed the case of Allah Abd el Fattah, who is on a hunger strike and now being force-fed through a tube by Egyptian police, I encourage you to check in. It's an important issue to think about. There's so many aspects of COP27 that are problematic because of Egypt's police state. The venue where it's being held is essentially owned by the intelligence service. It's a long backstory there. But if you search for COP27 Intelligence Egyptian Conference Center, you'll find some information on that. Yes, there's an abundance of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP27, as there always have been. They're, 80% of the world economy, the world energy economy is still fossil fuel. And this is very consequential for them, finding a path forward that makes the most of these fuels while we still are dependent on them, and cuts the emissions from that use as much as possible. So it's not surprising that they are a dominant force there. It's not actually a bad thing. If you think about it in terms of they're trying to slow things down, that's a bad thing. If you think about it in terms of the energy system of the world is essentially still running on fossil fuels. So if they have to be in the room, it's complicated. Nancy Pelosi was there. You probably heard her say it's too soon to know how the American election results will play out for climate action. And here's the more of the youth presence, which has been constrained by the again, Egyptian authorities have been trying to limit or at least orchestrate what kinds of demonstrations happen and don't happen. Samantha Power is the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, and they are a big part of what happens on the ground with the U.S. commitment to adaptation in 4 countries. Finance Day was a couple days ago. So we're going to call it, still waiting for the president to speak. That's going to take time. I'll write this up on my Substack blog, newsletter, whatever you want to call it. I hope you subscribe. There's a free subscription level. If you support it financially, that helps me keep it free for those who can't afford to help me keep this going. And again, this has been the Sustain Wet webcast from the Columbia Climate School. I'm Andy Revkin. I've been along this journey, the climate journey, for a very long time. I'm eager to get your questions and reactions. If you go to revkin.substack.com, anyone like Janice or the others here, Dana Younger. Oh, Dana asked a good question earlier about green hydrogen. We'll probably focus on that in the coming weeks. Doug Grant, you go to my Substack page, sign up free. It's free again, and you can post comments over there. Anna Caruso, particularly, I'd like to engage with you on the discussion we had about India. It's a nuanced issue, and I'd like to be sure we stay in touch on that, Anna Caruso. So thank you, Anne, for weighing in on energy options for developing world and the rest of us. Again, this is Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School, at Revkin on Twitter, where I'm staying for a while. You can follow me on Facebook too. Share this as soon as we're done with others. Wherever the link you're watching on, just post it, and do get in touch. Okay, do connect with me through the newsletter/blog. It's a good way to stay in touch and build a conversation. Take care and be well.